boss laughed, and I didn't say a word, not then. That moment, the one where everything shifted, happened on a Thursday night in November, in a private dining room at a steakhouse I could never have afforded on my own salary. 43 employees, 2 regional directors, and my father sitting in a chair by the window, still wearing the gray work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. He'd driven 2 hours to be there. He pressed his pants that morning. I know because he called me at 7 a.m. to ask if the crease looked right. He wanted to make a good impression. I need to back up because if I start at that dinner table, you won't understand why what happened next meant everything. You won't understand why I waited, why I didn't explode right there in front of 43 people, and you won't understand why, when I finally did act, it cost my boss everything, and I didn't lose a single thing that mattered. So let me start where it actually started. On a loading dock in Shreveport, Louisiana, in 1987, when my father was 24 years old and had nothing but a strong back and a willingness to show up before sunrise. He worked freight, not the glamorous kind, not logistics or supply chain management or whatever they call it now in the job listings. He moved boxes, he drove a forklift, he worked double shifts on holidays because the overtime pay was the difference between the electric bill getting paid and it not getting paid. My mother was pregnant with me when he took that job, and he never left it. Not in 31 years. Growing up, I knew what my father's hands looked like before I knew much else. The knuckles were always a little swollen. The palms were rough in a specific way, not just dry, but deeply lined. Like a roadmap to every year he'd spent lifting things other people needed moved. He smelled like the warehouse, a mix of diesel and cardboard and something metallic I could never name exactly. He'd come home, shower, eat whatever my mother left covered in foil on the stove, and be asleep by 9, up again at 4:30. He never complained. That was the thing I couldn't fully appreciate until I was older. He never sat at the dinner table and said, "This isn't what I wanted." He never looked at the neighbor's new truck with that specific kind of hunger I've seen in men who feel cheated by their lives. He just worked. And on weekends, he fixed things around the house, the gutters, the screen door that stuck, the porch light that kept going out. He had this philosophy he never stated directly, but lived completely. If something needs doing, you do it. You don't wait for someone else to come along and do it for you. I carried that with me when I left for college on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. I carried it through a business degree I finished in 3.5 years because I was in a hurry and I didn't have money to waste on an extra semester. I carried it into my first real job at a mid-sized consulting firm in Dallas, where I started as a junior analyst at 23 and worked my way up faster than anyone expected. By the time I was 31, I was a senior project manager. I oversaw a team of 11 people. I had a corner office that wasn't technically a corner, but faced the right direction in the morning. I had a company card and a parking spot and a boss named Mr. Whitmore, who I'll get to. Mr. Whitmore had been in the industry for 25 years. He was the kind of man who wore his success like a cologne you could smell from across the room. Not arrogant exactly, but comfortable, deeply, visibly comfortable, with the assumption that he had earned the right to judge other people's value on sight. He drove a car that cost more than my father earned in 4 years. He belonged to 2 private clubs and mentioned them both in the same breath whenever a new client came through. He was good at his job. I want to be fair about that. He was strategic and sharp, and he understood the business in a way that took years to develop. But he had a blind spot, and the blind spot was this. He believed that where a person came from told you something permanent about them, not where they went to school, not what they built, where they started. He'd make these small comments, nothing you could call out directly without sounding oversensitive. "Oh, you're from Shreveport?" "That's sure." A half-second pause before he'd pivot the conversation. The way he'd look at someone's shoes before he shook their hand. I noticed it. I filed it away. I told myself it didn't matter. The annual company dinner was a tradition. Every November, the firm rented out a private room at Hendrick's Chop House. The kind of place where the menus don't list prices and the waitstaff all speak at the same volume, which is quiet. It was part celebration, part performance review, part reminder of where everyone stood in the hierarchy. Spouses were invited. So were, occasionally, family members who had some significance to the employee's story. This year, Mr. Whitmore had made a point of encouraging people to bring someone meaningful. His words, "Bring someone who shaped you," He said it in the company-wide email, and he said it again in our team meeting. I think he expected people to bring parents who were doctors, or coaches who went on to become principals, or college professors who wrote them letters of recommendation. The kind of origin story that sounds good at a fundraising dinner. I invited my father. He drove up from Shreveport the afternoon of. I'd offered to get him a hotel room for the night so he wouldn't have to drive back late. He said no 3 times before I stopped asking. He parked his truck in the garage across the street and met me in the lobby of the restaurant at 6:45, 15 minutes early. He was wearing the blazer he bought for my college graduation. It still fit. He'd polished his shoes. He had his hair combed in the way he always did for important things, parted on the left with something that kept it flat. He shook my hand before he hugged me. He always did that. I don't know why. He just did. "You look good," he said. "So do you, Pop." He looked around the lobby, the dark wood paneling, the low lighting, the hostess stand with the leather-bound menus, and he nodded slowly, the way he did when he was taking inventory of something. "Nice place," he said. Not impressed exactly. Just noting the fact. We went in together. The room was already half full. My colleagues and their guests. Mr. Whitmore at the head of the long table talking to the regional director from Houston. I introduced my father around. My teammates were warm. The guy on my left, who'd worked with me on our biggest account that year, shook my father's hand and said, "Your son is the reason we hit our numbers. You should know that." My father looked at me and smiled with his whole face, the way he rarely did in public. It was a good night. For about an hour and 40 minutes, it was a genuinely good night. Dinner was winding down, the dessert plates were being cleared. Mr. Whitmore stood and gave the toast he always gave, something about excellence and commitment in the year ahead. And then he did something he hadn't done in previous years. He went around the table and acknowledged each person's guest. A little spotlight moment. He'd clearly done his homework. He knew who people had brought and why. He got to my father and paused. "And this is..." He looked at my father's shirt, the gray work shirt. He'd worn it under the blazer, the collar just visible at the neck. The name stitched above the pocket was partially hidden, but not completely. "This must be your father?" "Yes, sir," I said. "He drove up from Shreveport." Mr. Whitmore smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes. Shreveport. Well, he looked at his colleague from Houston and something passed between them. A half-second of shared understanding I was not supposed to catch. Then he leaned slightly toward the regional director and said, just low enough that he thought only that one person could hear, "Freight worker, 30 years. I guess that explains the work ethic." He said work ethic the way you'd say interesting choice of outfit. Like it was a punchline that he'd only partially delivered because we were in polite company. The regional director made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My father heard it. I know he did because I was watching his face. He didn't react. He just picked up his water glass and took a slow sip and set it back down and looked at the centerpiece on the table. That quiet dignity he'd practiced for 30 years, the one that kept him from ever letting anyone see him flinch. But I saw him flinch. Not on his face, not in his posture, in his hands. His right hand, the one resting on the white tablecloth, closed slowly into a loose fist and then opened again, like he was pressing something down. I sat with that for the rest of the dinner. I didn't say anything. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I shook hands when people started gathering their coats. I walked my father to the lobby and he said, "Good people you work with." And I said, "Yeah, Pop, most of them." He drove back to Shreveport that night. 2 hours, alone. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for 35 minutes and thought about a man who pressed his pants for an event where someone decided in 4 seconds that he was a punchline. I thought about 31 years of double shifts and polished shoes and a blazer kept in a garment bag for the right occasion. And I made a decision. Not a hot one. Not the kind where you fire off an email at midnight and regret it by morning. A cold one. The kind my father would have made, actually, if he'd been a different kind of man in a different kind of position. Patient. Documented. Airtight. See, what Mr. Whitmore didn't know, what very few people at that company knew, was that I had spent the better part of 2 years building something. Our department handled 2 of the firm's largest accounts. I'd been the primary architect on both of them. The client relationships ran through me. The deliverables, the processes, the methodology we'd developed. I had built the systems that made those accounts function. Mr. Whitmore presented the numbers upstairs. He got on the calls with the C-suite contacts and he was good at that part. But the engine was mine. I also knew, because I am thorough, because my father raised me to be thorough, that there had been several incidents over the past 18 months where Mr. Whitmore had attributed work to himself that was demonstrably, documentably mine. Emails where he'd forwarded my analysis without crediting me. A presentation to the board that used slides I built, word for word, with his name on the cover page. A client memo where a strategy I developed independently was introduced as his own initiative. I had copies of everything. Timestamps, the original files in my own folders. Thread after thread showing the sequence of who created what and when. I had never intended to use any of it. I'm not someone who walks around looking for leverage, but the night of that dinner, when I thought about my father's hand closing into a fist on that white tablecloth, I understood something. Staying quiet wasn't the same thing as being the bigger person. Sometimes staying quiet was just letting something wrong stay wrong. I requested a meeting with the firm's managing partner, not Mr. Whitmore's direct superior, but the person above that, the woman who had been with the company since the beginning and who had a reputation for being precise and unsentimental about the truth. I'd met her twice. She remembered my name. That mattered. I told her I needed 30 minutes and that it concerned the integrity of client-facing work product. That's the language that gets a meeting scheduled fast in consulting. We met on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the dinner. I laid everything out, not emotionally, not with a speech about my father or about dignity or about what it feels like to watch someone you love be dismissed. I kept that part behind my sternum where it belonged. What I put on the table was documentation. Clean, sequential, irrefutable. Here's the original analysis. Here is the date it was created. Here is the version that appeared in the board presentation under someone else's name. Here is the client memo. Here is the email thread showing I wrote the strategy 8 weeks before it was attributed to another source. She read everything I gave her. She asked 4 questions. I answered all 4. She said, "Thank you for bringing this to me directly." I said, "I want to be clear. I'm not interested in drama. I'm interested in accuracy." She nodded. Understood. I left. Went back to my desk. Worked through lunch. Did not tell a single person what I'd done. What happened over the next 11 days. I only know partially from what I saw directly and partially from what filtered back to me through the channels that always exist in any office. The quiet ones that run alongside the official ones. The managing partner opened an internal review. Standard process when crediting disputes are raised, apparently, though most people never see one. She pulled emails. She pulled file timestamps. She talked to people on my team, individually and separately. She talked to the Houston regional director. She talked to the clients. That last part is what broke it open, I think, because the clients, both of the major accounts, had been dealing with me directly for most of the past 2 years. When asked point blank who was the primary contact driving strategy and delivery on their accounts, they said my name, not because they were doing me a favor. Because it was true. On a Wednesday morning, Mr. Whitmore did not come in. By Thursday, there was a brief company-wide message from the managing partner about a leadership transition in our department. Effective immediately. No details, no explanation. Just the clean, professional language organizations use when something has gone wrong, but they don't want to explain exactly how wrong. By Friday, I was asked to step into the managing partner's office again. She told me the review was complete. She told me the findings were significant. She told me the firm would be making changes and that my role was being expanded as part of a restructuring, with a new title and a compensation adjustment that I will say was more than I expected. She also said something I didn't expect. She said, "I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer if you'd rather not." I said, "Go ahead." "What made you decide to come forward now? You've been here 4 years. This didn't start recently." I thought about it for a second. The honest answer was my father's hand on a white tablecloth. But that felt too personal for this room, too specific, and I wasn't ready to give it to her. So I said, "Someone reminded me that doing the right thing and doing the quiet thing aren't always the same thing." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Fair enough." I called my father that night. He picked up on the second ring. He always picks up on the second ring, like he's been sitting close to the phone but doesn't want to seem like it. I didn't tell him everything. I told him there had been some changes at work, that things were going well, that I'd been recognized for some of the work I'd put in. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "They figure out what you're worth?" "Yeah," I said. "Pretty much." He made a sound that wasn't a word exactly. A low, satisfied, like someone confirming a fact they already knew. Good, he said. I asked him how the truck was running. He said fine. I asked if the porch light was still giving him trouble. He said he fixed it 2 Saturdays ago, took him 20 minutes once he figured out it was the fixture and not the wiring. We talked for another 40 minutes about nothing that mattered and everything that did. When we hung up, I sat for a while in my apartment with the lamp on and the TV off, and I thought about a man who drove 2 hours to press his pants for someone who made up his mind in 4 seconds. And I thought about the fact that my father never needed anyone in that room to tell him what he was worth. He already knew. He'd known for 31 years. It was the rest of the world that needed catching up.